Hegel's about to make this claim on 120. Before I launch into all this, before we do this, fine. Are there questions for me, things you want to ask about where we are at this point? Things make relative sense, not perfect sense? Yeah.
Just to make sure, like in Hegel, are there these like little mini threads where like you said, becoming, negation, and then infinity? Is that like one single thread of that concept development? And there's multiple of those that have operating while the text is going?
Yeah, and I'll try, I mean, as we get deeper into the logic, I'll track these even more, but Hegel's already doing this, right? When he's saying that we start off talking about becoming, and that looked like, was the third to being a nothing. This is how things work. What we realize is that this is fundamental, right? This isn't outside of being and nothing. It doesn't subsume them underneath it. It designates really coming to being and passing away. That's all it is. And then he says, well, the same thing is going on with negation. Here it's about something, other. Negation is really this work of relating these two and generating both of those moments. So it's this as well. So now what he's really telling you is that what looked like it came last was, the consequent of all those really was fundamental all along. Well, where's it at again? Infinity is that. True infinity is that. Because what's true infinity? True infinity is nothing other than finite and the finite infinite. Here's the two relata, right? Here's the relation. What's true infinity? True infinity is this. Where it's not some third thing over against the first two that subsumes them in some way, which is a standard way of understanding how dialectics works. It's not how Hegel thinks of it. Hegel has just said in those passages that all that I'm really talking about with true infinity, all that's being named here, is this process that generates both of these moments. We tend to start with finitude and then go over to infinity. We've also seen that you can start with infinity and go over to finitude. They entail one another, exactly right, but why that happens, why they're mutually implicatory, is because they bear this intrinsic relation. This is an extrinsic, this is an intrinsic relation between them. But this intrinsic relation is something that's a product of a process, this. So when he calls it, as he's about to here, this is on the middle of page 120, in this transition, he says, this imminent turning back as the sublating of finitude, that is, a finitude as such, and equally of the negative finitude that only stands opposite to it, is only negative finitude, is self-relating being, right? So he's just saying, this whole thing is a process. It turns back upon itself. The finite comes to be itself by not being the infinite comes to be itself by not being the finite. It turns back upon itself. Well, that turning back upon itself, and that generating of both moments as a result of that, is what true infinity is. So he says, is self-relation, you have self-reference here, self-relation I think is better, being. So now he's saying, look, this is still what we started off the book with, we're still talking about that, we're still talking about that same thing. So this is all that there is, but now it's got some kind of determination to it that it did not have in the vacuousness with which we started, being pure being. And he says, since there is negation in this being, the latter is existence. So being now is existence, being is, Sein is Dasein, is what he's literally saying in German. But further, so we've moved on from just that moment, but further, since the negation is essentially negation of the negation, self-relating, you have self-referencing, self-relating negation, it is the existence that carries the name, so it's Dasein, that carries the name of being for itself. So what he's doing is he's just saying this is being for itself. Where's his son? Where's his son? Now, what that means, right, this identification he's making at the end of it is, as we've oftentimes seen, this just names what this is. It's not some new concept that comes along and subsumes it. Now it's just a name for what this is. It's a name for what the infinitizing movement is. But notice what it's done that hasn't been on the table before. This is the key thing to get. What's been on the table before is always reality versus negation, something versus other, being versus nothing. They're all related to one another, where if there's any self-relating, like there is in something, it's over against the other. And we still see that at one level with this, right? We see the finite as the non-infinite, we see the infinite as the non-finite. So there's that kind of othering of each one They stand on their own, separate from each other. So they're separable from one another. But with true infinity, they're necessarily integrated within one another. So now that continual overturning that we had with alteration here, that continual overturning has now itself been integrated within the process itself. It's generative of the whole of being itself. That's what he means by being for itself. So the self-relation of something is not being for self. Being for itself is coming to be itself, both finite and the infinite, in their being other than themselves. And that othering of themselves is now integral to them. I'm sorry, I went on to something else, but did you want to come back to that? Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's helpful. I was just wondering, like, I mean, maybe this is like, maybe I should think about this by myself, but what does it mean to have like a thread, like in this, because there's already like a sequence and then there's this conceptual thread. Like how do we, for example, when we look at true infinity and then we look at becoming, you make sure to differentiate them using different descriptions. But does that mean that when we are at true infinity, where is becoming when we're at that stage, where is becoming? Did we just get rid of that, or is it somewhere else now, or is true infinity kind of like the truth of becoming, or all these thoughts come to me, but I don't really know how to like deal with them.
So let me step back out of the text for a moment and try to address this a little bit, because I think it could be useful just conceptually. If you think about the doctrine of being as a very, what I call, others have heard me say this before, so I apologize for this, but I think it might be helpful here, to start from here at least, that it's a flat ontology, right? There's no depth here, there's no behind anything, there's no depth at all here. Everything is, if you want to call it surface, fine, but that's already kind of a problem because that already sounds like there's something below the surface, right? It's really not the issue. It's just a very flat ontology. But that flat ontology has dimensions to it, right? So you're boring down into being, right? It's literally what's happening, as I imagine what's going on here. So you start off at the surface level saying, what is being? Being is indeterminate, vacuousness, empty, nothing. So you start there and you realize, well, no, those actually vanish into one another, so that's becoming. Okay, so your first level of any kind of process or activity is there at becoming. So that's the most, minimal determination of what process we could talk about would be. But then as you go through and unfold what each one of these determinations entails, it takes you back to that same moment, becoming in this case. It also takes you back to reality negation, but let's stay with becoming for a moment. That's the thread we're tracing through. And it reveals that in a deeper dimension of the same one flat ontology. So you're boring down into being and seeing, how does this work? So if you ask me at this moment, right, in a second I'll say it's about attraction or repulsion, but for the moment we could say, okay, what makes possible becoming? True infinity does. So there's becoming, there's coming to being and passing away. There is othering of something, right? There's alteration that goes on. Those things are real, they happen. There is not the deeper truth within being itself of why those things happen and are definitive of being. They're definitive of being because being is necessarily infinitizing. That is to say, it's becoming other than itself in order to be itself. So that's the moment now we're at when we say, okay, being for itself. That names then the totality of this process and the structure of that process. Is that useful?
Is that like a result?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, this is the result,
Yeah.
which is the truth of everything that preceded it, which doesn't, as you were asking about this, I think this is important, doesn't do away with everything that preceded it. Do things come to be and pass away? Sure they do. Right? Becoming hasn't been abolished, right? It hasn't been abandoned in that sense. It's just, it's not sufficient unto itself. If you want to do it in these terms, I think this is relevant. It's not sufficient unto itself to explain itself, to account for itself. Becoming can't account for its own nature. So where do we go to find out, well, becoming is made possible by alteration at one level. Oh, well, is that sufficient? No, it's actually not sufficient. What's sufficient? It looks like at this point, infinity, true infinity is sufficient to account for that. Why things necessarily come to be and pass away, why they alter and change. Those higher level, or lower level, however you want to think about it, but higher level determinations. Does that make sense?
Yes. I do wonder, like, is it, when we think about, like, when we are true infinite, there's this tendency to like, this, okay, the sufficiency language is there some other way to think about becoming or negation when we are finally at the being for itself stage? In the sense that if you think of becoming as insufficient, but it's still like true, right? Like it's still kind of like there. So shouldn't we also think of it in a way that still stands from that stage of true infinity? Like instead of, like, is there another way to talk about it than saying like this is not sufficient, we must move on?
It's real, but insufficient to account for itself. It's real, it exists. He's attesting to it as an ontological reality. It's not a mistake, it's not a mistake of thought, it's not an illusion, right? None of that. Becoming is real, alteration is real. They're just not sufficient unto themselves to be able to account for their own activity. Why does something come to be and pass away? Just asking that question is not answerable within the confines of becoming alone. That things come to be and pass away, manifestly the case. Why do they come to be and pass away? No clue. Not under there. That's why I'm using the sufficiency language for that. Alteration begins to give you an account of that, right? Why do things come to be and pass away? Because they're always othered, right? They always propel themselves beyond themselves, right? Internally, they ought to be other than they are. That's why they come to be and pass away. Because the moment of their birth is the moment of their death, right? That line. That's why they come to be and pass away. That's the explanation for that. But then that's not sufficient either, right? Because that just gives you a finite and infinite separated from one another. And then they turn out to be dependent on one another, mutually implicative of one another. But that's because they're both moments of a common process, that they're moments of themselves. Yeah?
Yeah, I guess I asked you this question because of what Deleuze says about lack, and I was wondering like what you think of that like the language of lack and then the language of like sufficiency, and you just answered that already. So
okay.
now
Well, I mean, Deleuze is worried about lack always being privation, right?
Yeah.
Privation of a greater plenitude. And Hegel is saying, I don't know anything about a greater plenitude. Here is lack vis-a-vis other more fundamental dimensions, but there's not some ultimate plenitude that these are all lacking. There's not a chain of being. This is the way Deleuze is talking about it. It's a chain of being, and all these are lacks of that, privations of that. Hegel's not talking about a privation of some greater fundamental plenitude, of which all these are limitations. He's talking about negation being fundamental itself.
that makes sense. Yeah,
I'm sorry?
that makes sense.
If that makes sense, then we're doing pretty well. But I don't know if that makes sense. I hope that that's starting to make some sense, at least what that would mean, right? That's all I'm saying, right? So
it helps with like how he sees things versus like how to get out of that.
yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, so my question is about the process of negation. So I know it's determinate negation that is generative.
Yeah.
And we seem to have different, I want to say like types of negation.
Mhm.
Sometimes we have this vanishing, then there's more stability.
Yep.
Sometimes it's over and against, sometimes they're more integrated. So
Right.
I wanted to know if this negation itself is like taking different forms, or if we get these different types of it just due to like the relata or what is being related. Like is negation consistent throughout? Is it always operating in the same way? Or are there like different types of negation?
Right. So this is a fantastic question. I'm glad you asked it because it really does. It's true to what's going on in the text, right? This isn't the same damn type of negation every time, right? It looks like there's different modalities or different forms that this negation takes, given the context it's operating in. And I think the answer to that question you're asking, is that the case?
Yeah.
I think that's exactly true. Right? Now, there's another question to be asked about that, and that's to say, well, is there ever some general account of negation that is, so to speak, the master account of how negation works at all times? Let's see, right? But for the moment, and Hegel will say this, right? So he's aware of this. He will say, in the doctrine of being, negation works this way. We'll get to passages where he says this way. He does these retrospective passages where he talks about this way. He says negation works this way in the doctrine of being. Negation works this way in the doctrine of essence. So he's going to acknowledge exactly what you're saying, not at the microscopic level that you're talking about, but it's implied that's also true. But at the macroscopic level of saying, look, it operates differently here, it operates differently in the doctrine of essence. He says, in the doctrine of being, they transition into one another. That's what negation really does. It's always transitory. It's one going into another. We've seen that already with alteration, for example, becoming's that way, change. But then he also says in the doctrine of essence, it's about reflection, right? What that means, we'll get to in the doctrine of essence. So he's going to note this difference. And that to me says, yes, he's acknowledged this, and then he also wants to say that there is a master account of how that negation works. But we haven't yet gotten there, we're not entitled to get there. We want it, right, because we're already seeing it, but we're not entitled to it because we haven't gotten to it on its own. We're seeing its products, but we're not seeing it full stop on its own. It's not finished doing what it's doing. Right? And it's only once it's completed all the determinations that it has that we can then fully and rightly, justifiably turn to an account of it itself. That's what the doctrine of the concept will be.
All right, so I'll revisit next quarter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just, that's how it works. That's literally how the book
Yeah,
works,
yeah.
right? Is that the doctrine of the concept is, okay, you want to know what the process is? Here's what the process is on its own terms. You're going to be massively disappointed, but that is that's what's on offer there, right? Whereas here you're seeing, like you're talking about, you're seeing it working in different ways. Sometimes it's vanishing, sometimes it's othering, sometimes it's auditing, sometimes it's infinitizing, right. But I think it's always, the right thing to do is what you're talking about, to track it, to see how it's doing. Because one of the points that Hegel's continually making is that in our thinking about metaphysics, we always think of negation as, this goes back to the previous question, as secondary, as a privation of being itself, rather than as generative of being. And that's, in short, what the logic is trying to get us to see, is that non-being is not incidental to being. That non-being is what it is to be. And that has a lot of other implications, right? He's pulling out, that's really what it is. And the many forms that takes.
Thank you.
So, the many ways of being, the categories, right? Aristotle starts off the categories by saying there's many ways in which being is, and let's talk about the manifold ways of being. I often think you can talk about the science of logic as the manifold ways in which non-being is. And it's precisely what Hegel's doing. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I misheard you or what, but I think you said that true infinity is a process while finite infinity is not.
Yeah.
So in what sense is finite infinity not I just don't understand how finite infinity is not a process.
It's not a process because it's a relation to the finite. It's a rigid, always standing outside of that which has been constituted in the finite. It's the beyond of the finite. So it's always a static, resolute, stable beyond. Okay? So it's not a process. It's the moment, right? That towards which finitude is always approximating but never actually achieving. Similarly, the finite is not a process either. The finite is always this thing after this thing after this thing after this thing. It's one damn thing after another. It's one state of the quality of reality changing into another state of the quality of reality. They all have self-relation, but that self-relation is always being undone as well. So what neither one of those two sides actually captures is the process that generates both of them in their necessary relationship to one another. That's what true infinity is that process. Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
We good? Yeah. So
you can also put this to the doctrine of the concept, but I was thinking about
Hegel.
And just in the introduction we talked about how so the whole project of post-Kantian sort of ontological monism is to try and find a unitary basis of giving an account of reason.
Yeah.
And then Hölderlin has the ether, or that is being.
Yeah.
So would the difference between Hölderlin and Hegel simply be in the fact that for Hegel it's a more ether is true static as opposed to
In Hölderlin.
yes.
Yeah.
As opposed to here the process is more dynamic. So the unity of being is actually differentiation.
Right. So I want to acknowledge that, then I'm going to answer the question more directly, but I want to acknowledge that this is there's a debate in Hölderlin studies about whether the ether is oneness or is it already differentiating from itself. The reason why there's a debate in Hölderlin studies about that is because Hölderlin says both. Right? So in the preface to Hyperion, he says the one others itself. But then he talks about the ether as the oneness of all things that has no differentiation within it. So he's not clear about which one of those he ultimately thinks is the case. Hegel is, I think, clear, because he wants to say the ether, as he thinks Hölderlin thinks of it, is a oneness where differentiation happens secondarily. The question is, how does that happen, right? And in Hölderlin, he doesn't think you have any answer. No, you have no resources for thinking how that happens, because the differentiation, right, the entitlement, the originary separation, playing on that notion, judgment, right, is something that happens to the oneness, the primordial oneness of being, but it's not any way to account for it. Because in Hölderlin, the ether, the oneness of being, has no non-being within it. Hegel is saying that's just not understanding the nature of being. Being is always inherently non-being. So I think that's right? So what you would get in Hölderlin is a static conception of being, and then you have the problem of how do we get determination out of static oneness. This is his problem with Schelling, right? It's no different with Schelling. Schelling says the ultimate oneness of all things is the indifference point, right? This is early Schelling, but it'll suffice for this. It's the indifference point. The question is, well, how do you get differentiation out of indifference? Famously, this is in the preface to the phenomenology. This is the fighting words, the break between him and Schelling, Hegel and Schelling. That's the night in which all cows are black. How do you have any cows? Right? So that's the problem. How do you get any determination? Right? Schelling never forgave him for that, right? For that public dispute, right? And that charge made against him. And that was the locus of their debate, right? And it comes from both of them in different ways, in my view, descending from Hölderlin, right? For this, what's the nature of the ether?
I have a second question.
And what does it mean to be a monist, right? To be an ontological monist,
Yeah,
right? Does it
yeah.
mean that there to be an indifferent oneness that has sameness, but how do you then account for determination? Or does determination have to be, so to speak, built into the very oneness of the ontological foundation of all things? Hegel thinks the latter, the others think the former. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So the second question, I guess, would be if the conviction of ontological monism is something that precedes the system,
Yeah.
or it comes, where can you situate it? Is it already something that you're aiming for before the system itself?
Yeah.
Or?
So Hölderlin and Schelling's answer would be different than Hegel's, right? Hölderlin and Schelling's answer would be intellectual intuition. You already got it. It's self-evident that we live in the oneness of all things within the ether. The question then becomes philosophical reasoning, and discursive reasoning's project is to explain how the various things that have determinacy have it by virtue of being within that ether itself. So that's their way. That's what discursive intellect does vis-a-vis intuitive intellect. Hegel will have none of that. Right? So he doesn't start with being in the sense of it's the foundation of all things. We start with being because it's the most vacuous thing there is. It's the most vacuous concept. So all the determinations have to flow out of what's ever there already, the resources that are already there within being itself. And so what he's interested in is what we get to at the end, not what we get to, not that which we start from, but that which is entailed by all of this. That's what he's trying to ultimately. And he doesn't have a conviction about that. If he does, then he's violated his own, we can have no presuppositions. So this is the, that presuppositionalist claim is what's at issue, I think, there, right? Schelling says you can't do philosophy without a presupposition. You can't. You have to have a commitment already to something, and to that something having a certain kind of nature. And then, if you can have that be self-evident, intellectual intuition, then you can proceed from there. But if you can't have that, then how are you going to get anything going? But everything you derive from it will be short of it, and will be inadequate to it. It'll be negative or respond to its positivity, is the way Schelling puts it later in his career. Is that useful?
Kind of.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot more to do with this, right? So let's keep revisiting it. But that's the beginnings, at least, of an attempt to answer the question. So what kind of monism is Hegel giving us?
No, if it's already, I guess one way out of it could be to say that you have being, which is at the beginning vacuous, and then it's retrogressively grounded.
Yeah.
And it gets its whole determination at the end.
Yeah.
So you could say that the conviction of there being actually, how do you go from Kantian dualism,
Yeah.
why do you say that, no, that's not true, but it's actually a monist ontology without saying, I mean, before the system, how can you make that claim? Because at the end of the system, it could be the case that you come to another dualism.
Yeah. Yeah, Hegel thinks you have to work through the dualistic structure of consciousness itself. This is the mediated route into the this is the phenomenological route into the system, in order to undo that subject-object dichotomy already, and to show that that's not itself sustainable, that it can't actually withstand its own criticism. So, Hegel says, I'm reducing the phenomenology down, but I think this is roughly right. The phenomenology is the critique carried through to its fullness, where it really critiques itself completely. And that would undermine its own subject-object phenomenal divide as well. That's where you would be at oneness. But then what's that oneness really about? Well, you can't just say, well, we see it now, so that's all great and wonderful. You've got to unpack it. All right, so back to this passage here for just a moment. So he says here, this imminent turning back on both sides, as a subletting of finitude, that is a finite as such, finitude as such, and equally of the negative finitude, infinite, that only stands opposite to it, is only negative finitude, is self-relational in relation to itself being. Since there is negation in this being, the latter is existent. But further, since the negation is essentially a negation of the negation, self-related negation, it is the existence that carries the name of being for itself, Führerstein. So what Führerstein is, being for itself, is just the name for this process of infinitizing that is true infinity. That's all it is. And what makes it different than the self-relation of something is that now the self-othering, the self-negation, which had been there, right, in something another, but always stood, let's say, outside of the something self-relation, has now been integrated into the self-relating itself. So now it's self-relating by virtue of its own self-othering. It's self-relating by virtue of its own self-othering. So that's what being for itself is, over against the something. And Hegel's quite aware that, I know these look like the same thing, but they're not the same thing. And the difference really is about this, what's happened is now we've brought in the self-othering moment, the othering or negation moment, into the self-relating moment itself. So now they have to be thought integrated into one another as moments of one process. So you can say that now finitude is determinate, but determinate not in relation to simply to what is other than it, but rather is determinate with respect to itself. Not just with respect to what's other than it, but respect to itself. The finite is folded back upon itself, and in this way comes to be what it most fundamentally is. It's the self-negation, the self-relation of existence. Infinity is therefore the mode of being, the way of being, that is what finitude itself is. Infinity just is finitude, right? Infinity just is finitude. And this way of being, this quality of existing, is for the finite to be fundamentally the process of relating to itself in and through what is other than it. True infinity is thus existence as being for itself. Now, if that's right, then we get to this very interesting chapter at the end of the quality section where he talks about the being for itself relation, and he talks about it in terms of the one and the many. He talks about it in terms of attraction and repulsion. He talks about it in terms of this crazy thing called the void, and this crazy thing called the becoming of the ones. So you have many ones, and then he says at the end of it, right, this amazing claim. Yeah, take a look on page 144, over to 145. So take a look at the end of this process, and I'll come back and take us through the moments of it. He says, with this, this is the final paragraph on 144, it's 165 in the German. With this, the development of being for itself is completed and has attained its result. Okay, good, what's that result? So we've gone through this whole one-many thing, the attraction repulsion. Where does it get us? Look what he says. In connecting itself to itself infinitely, that is, as the posited negation of negation. Notice, infinitely there doesn't mean ad infinitum, it means self-relating to itself in and through otherness. So it's true infinity, it's infinitizing. he says, the one is the mediation by which it repels itself as its absolute, that is abstract otherness, the many from itself, and is thus negatively connecting itself to this, its non-being. It sublates it and is in it precisely only the connection relationship to itself. The one is only this becoming in which the determination it begins, so there's like an it that begins, is being posited as an immediate existence, and equally that, as a result, has restored itself as the one, that is the equally immediate and exclusive one has vanished. So it begins, there's one, but also it vanishes into many. So there's one that's many and many that's one. That dyad recurs here. And it says, the process which it is posits and contains it from all sides only as something sublated. So both moments are there only as taken up in the movement of the process as a whole. The sublation determined at first only as a relative sublation of the connection to another existent, so it looks like it's just many ones, right? Another existent. A connection which is therefore itself not an indifferent repulsion and attraction, equally proves itself to pass over into the infinite connection of mediation through the negation of the external connection of immediate and determinate existence. What's that? What are existence? Already we should start talking about how is he using one and many here? Right? How can there be many anythings? There's not many. Right? There's one, self-relation, but many is a quantitative concept, isn't it? That's a problem. He then says, through the negation of the external connection of immediate and determinate existence, and to have for result precisely that becoming which, in the instability of its moments, is the collapse. What kind of collapse is going on here? What's collapsing? What's falling apart? Or rather, the going together with itself into simple immediacy. What's gone into itself? What's the simple immediacy? Then, just to kick that off, this being, according to the determination which it now has acquired, is quantity. So if you get nothing else out of those paragraphs, out of that paragraph, you ought to get this. He's asserting in that paragraph that quality, when it has being for itself, and what that entails, what that ultimately results in is that quality is necessarily quantity. That's what just was asserted. That quality, when it does what it does, now that infinitizing is not something that happens to it, but is actually it, then it goes through its own determination, one, many, attraction, repulsion. How that all works we'll talk about, but the result of all that is that it becomes something that it's not originally. Quality becomes something other than itself. So once quality has fully determined itself, it doesn't determine itself any longer as quality. It determines itself as something other than quality. It determines itself as quantity. Now, what do we mean by quantity? We mean something that can increase or decrease without determining it differently. That's all we mean by it. We don't mean some fixed quantity. We don't mean some thing yet. None of that's there. We just mean the concept of what we will call magnitude. Magnitude. It can be increased and decreased, but it doesn't change it at all. Okay, but how do we get from quality, which was, nice, simple reality, with a little bit of negation baked in, that, kind of went nutso and gave us infinity, where we were starting to realize, wait a minute, being is existence and existence is infinity because it's constantly changing, and that constantly changing process is named infinity, and that is the being for itself process. That's what it is. You say, okay, I'll buy all that, maybe, but you're telling me that that necessarily entails that quality is quantity. How in the world does that work? So let me walk us through this and try to make some sense of that. I'm not going to be able to dwell on any particular text because of the time, but let me just talk about it in general terms. Let's first of all deal with just the terminology here, one and many. Hegel looks to be using quantitative language. Let's just say he is using quantitative language. But he's not using it quantitatively because he's not entitled to that. And if you look at what he actually does with it, he's not talking about things. So when he says many ones, which he will say, the one generates many ones, he's not talking about many quantifiably discrete ones. He's talking about a repetition of oneness. A repetition of oneness. The oneness of reality. That's all he's talking about. Nothing more, nothing less than that. So one and many, we want to sever from our standard, oh, that's discrete entities he's talking about. He's not talking about discrete entities. Misleading, right? The language he's using here. That's what he thinks oneness is. Oneness is about the self-relation, and many is about its differentiation. So he's trying to capture this same structure we've been talking about as something and other, right? Alteration, finitude, and the non-finite infinity. He's still talking about that, but now talking about that as moments within one process. And he's saying oneness is the self-relation that others itself. Initially, it others itself as simple otherness, where that otherness is abstract, and that abstractness is a void. There's nothing there. It's empty, vacuous. But it can't remain that void because it actually determines, that void determines the one as being what it is. So it's actually productive. So it actually produces not just the oneness, it does produce that, but it produces many ones because it's going to produce, like always, changes in that state. So the many ones are many different states of oneness. One commentator calls this Hegel's version of cloning. Right? This is where you get oneness. The becoming of those ones is where the oneness is happening again, happening again, happening again, because the negation is undermining it. So once he's introduced that language of one and many in a non-quantitative, let's say a qualitative sense only, he then immediately says, okay, so if we're going to talk about this as one becomes many, and the many are necessarily constitutive of oneness, then we've got to think about this not in purely relational terms. We've got to think about this in process terms. So he introduces the language of attraction and repulsion. How does the one become many? It repulses itself from itself. How does it still become one in that manying of itself? In that repulsion, it attracts itself at the same time. Now, attraction and repulsion, just another way of naming this same stuff we've already talked about, but now within the structure itself, now within infinitizing true infinity itself. So attraction and repulsion is our first attempt then to try to give, like we were asking about before, what's the actual rule by which this negational process operates? It operates in accordance with attraction and repulsion. That's the first stab, if you put it, the first minimal determination of what that process is doing now in itself. Now, if that makes some sense, repulsion and attraction, here we're on, just to kind of give you some passages, 142 and 144 is what I'm looking at. He says there, this is on, take a look on, take a look at 142. This is the third full paragraph down. Third full paragraph down. 163 in the German. If we take mere repulsion in this way, everybody see where I'm at? So repulsion is the name for the othering of the one of itself, right? The othering of itself, becoming many. If we would take repulsion in this way for itself, it is then the dispersion of the many ones in indeterminacy. It's what generates, it's generative of the many ones. This is, we've already seen, this is alteration, is the earlier name for this, but now we see it as, now it's not just alteration that happens because the negativity is affecting being, right? But now it's actually endemic to being itself. It others itself. It repulses from itself. Outside the sphere of repulsion itself, for repulsion is the negating of the connection of the many to one another. Lack of connection is their determination when abstract rotation, but repulsion is not just the void. The ones, although unconnected, do not repel what constitutes their determination, do not exclude it. Although negative, repulsion is nonetheless essentially connection. It is repulsing them, but it's also what bears them in relationship to that from which they're generated, the one from which they're generated. The mutual repulsion in flight is not a liberation from what is repelled and fled from. That which is excluded still stands in connection, in relation with what is excluded from it. But this moment of connection is attraction. So where there's repulsion, it's not complete and utter obliteration. It's always still the holding of those together. Attraction. So if there's one and it differentiates itself through repulsion into many, if there's the oneness of being, and it differentiates itself into many different states, many different ones of being, then those are not just dispersed from one another and have no relationship to one another. They're born in relationship to one another precisely through there being repulsions of that oneness. So they're attracted at the same time. They're repulsed and attracted. So he says on 144, the bottom of 144 where we were earlier, yeah. So take a look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines up from the bottom of 144. He says there, the sublation determinate first only as a relative sublating of the connection to another existence. Here, those many, right? That's the sublating of those relations. The many are canceling but also preserved and they're relating to one another. That's repulsion and attraction at the same time. He says, a connection which is therefore in itself not an indifferent repulsion and attraction. It's not indifferent, it actually holds them all together. Equally proves itself to pass over in two. So that's the pivotal line. Because what he's just said is, look, you want to know what being for self is? It's attraction and repulsion. You know what that is? It's the oneness, the self-relatingness of reality, where it's differentiating from itself into many ones, but those many ones are born in relationship to one another. So it's repulsion and the attraction of those together. So he says, the sublation, leave out the stuff in the dependent clause, the sublation, a connection which is therefore itself not an indifferent repulsion and attraction. It's not that. Right? So that's where we got to. So far, so good? Because now things start to pivot. Look at what he does. It equally proves itself to pass over into the infinite connection of mediation through the negation of the external connection of immediate determinate existence. And to have for result, what just happened? Let's leave it, we don't know. But it says, for result precisely that becoming which, in the instability of its moments, is the collapse. Okay, I thought things didn't collapse. Right, that's what he just said. But he says it equally is a collapse. How does that work? His claim is that the self-relation differentiates itself in order to be a self-relation. One becomes one by manying itself. So that repulsion, differentiating from itself, that repulsion of itself from itself, is at the same moment the attraction of those to one another, bearing of those to one another. That's the first part of that sentence. But then he says, okay, so we've gotten to that where they're not indifferent to one another. And yet, because it's attraction and repulsion, they actually do fundamentally cancel one another out as moments distinct from one another. It's just one bloody process. There's not distinction there anymore. So they are indifferent in the end to one another. Here he says then, you have for the result, equally proves itself to pass over into the infinite connection of mediation through negation of the external connection of immediate and determinate existence. Nothing can stand outside. If everything is ultimately repulsed, it's also ultimately attracted. So they go together into one another. They form what I'm about to call, Hegel never says this, but it's useful to have a name for it. They form a blobject. It's a blob. It's all it is. That's all Hegel's talking about here. A quality of being that's now been rendered indistinct. We followed quality and relation, negation, something, other, alteration, finitude, infinity. We followed all that through to true infinity, being for itself. And what does that ultimately get us? Determination, absolutely. It gets us that. So if you want to know what being is as quality and its full determination, it's attraction and repulsion. Full stop. But if it is that, then it's not just quality. This is Hegel's point, right? That if quality proves out to be, as he thinks he's been able to show, that when the self-othering is endemic to, if othering is endemic to oneness itself, self-relation itself, then ultimately that's going to become indistinct from one another. That the repulsion and the attraction are going to cancel one another out. And the resultant collapse of either side is what you get. And what do you get at the end of that? Quality is no longer quality. Quality is necessarily an indistinct magnitude. It's quantity, as he says here. Becoming which in the instability of its moments, notice the instability of its moments, so they fall apart. They collapse, or rather the going together with itself into simple immediacy. This recurs throughout Hegel, right? The moment you think, we've got full-fledged, full determinacy, everything you could want here, it's all there. We are done. He says, well, you are done with that concept because you've got its full determinacy on view. You've laid it all out. There's nothing more for quality to be. That's quality in its full determinateness. Absolutely, right, I agree fully with you. And yet, you can't stop there. Why? Because that negativity that's at work there undermines the stability of that determination too. Quality as a determination is ultimately unstable to itself. It collapses, it falls apart into itself. Now you'll say, so it destroys itself. Hegel says, well, that's a little quick. It doesn't destroy itself. Let's slow that train down, right? And see what it actually does. What it does is it collapses in upon itself, where it's no longer distinct. It is indifference itself. Now look at what he says over on 152. This is 175 in the German. The difference between quantity and quality has been indicated. You think, okay, we're talking about the difference between reality and magnitude, right? The reality that something exists, and the magnitude, how much it exists. That's the difference. Quality is the first immediate determinateness. And he says, I knew I was reversing that, right? But that's what you have to start with. It's vacuous, it's immediate determinateness. Quantity is the determinateness that has become indifferent to being. There is a distinction as he understands it, right? One is pure immediacy, pure vacuous indeterminacy. That's quality. But quality, unfolded into its determination, ultimately proves to be indifferent to itself. Indeterminate, what indifference means. Indeterminate to itself. That means it's what? Quantity. Quantity is the determinate that has become indifferent to being. A limit which is just as much no limit. And then he knows this is a problem, right? So in 1831, he has this little extra bit you have here. Being for itself, so he goes back and gets that concept from quality, right? Being for itself, which is just true infinity, right? That's our good friend, right? Attraction, repulsion. He says, which is absolutely identical with being for another. They've collapsed in upon themselves, right? Self-othering, attraction, repulsion, they've collapsed in upon themselves. The repulsion of the many ones, which is immediate non-repulsion, their continuity. So he's just reminding you, that's how the transition's made. The transition is not something where quantity comes along and says, quality has died. So long, quality. Now we'll replace that with quantity. No, quantity names what quality is in its full and complete determination. Quantity names what quality is in its full and complete determination. Because in its full and complete determination, it's what? It's one many, which is the movement of attraction and repulsion, where attraction and repulsion ultimately collapse in on themselves and therefore render it indifferent to being itself. There is no determination. That's what indifferent means. It's not an attitudinal problem, right? I'm indifferent to you. No, this is indeterminate. So, surprisingly, we start with vacuous being, we unfold it into its determinacy. We don't get back to vacuous being again, right? Everything doesn't fall apart, we go back to vacuous being. We've reached a higher stage of determination, but that higher stage of determination is no longer quality anymore. It's an indeterminacy, but it's not the indeterminacy of being. It's the indeterminacy that marks out now something that's indeterminate to its very existence. It doesn't matter whether you increase it or decrease it. It is what it is, regardless of that. And that means it's no longer being in terms of quality, it's now become quantity. That's what the concept is. If that makes a little bit of sense, then we can begin to unpack the quantity discussion. Right? But I tried to systematize this by looking at this premise conclusion form. It's a bit ludicrous to try to do this here, but I've always found this transition, like a lot of transitions in Hegel, to be particularly mysterious. Right? So I tried to walk my way through it, and I tried to base it in the text. So here's what I think goes on here. So the sublation of the one and the many proves to be a process of repulsion of the one from itself into the many, and the attraction of them back into it unto itself, and is the indeterminacy, indifference that this process generates that is quantity. So that's just states the whole process that's going on, or the whole argument that's going on. So let me try to unpack it premise conclusion form. So I think it's, has 3 premises and 2 conclusions along the way. Right? I'm not claiming this is perfect, but it gets, I think this is the roadmap pretty well. So the sublation of one and many is initially relative in that it is a relation with 2 distinct moments, one and many, as a result is determinate. So that's where we start off with being for itself, has this oneness, and it has the manyness, has the sameness, has diversity, differentiation, that's what we start off with. But this relation is nothing other than the process of becoming other, repulsion, in order to become what it is, attraction. So we've seen this is standard Hegel sort of 101 at this point for us. Everything is what it is. The relata are what they are by virtue of a process. Here the process is named not infinitizing, but attraction and repulsion. Consequently, the moments of the relation which have been initially distinct are now blended into one another. Repulsion just is attraction, and attraction just is repulsion. They are identified. So there's the first conclusion you can draw, and that's what I think of as, okay, if you were just asking me what is quality, the quality of being unto itself, what is qualitative being unto itself, that's where you would end. You would say, okay, it's ultimately has to be shown to be attraction or repulsion. That's the nature of being. That's what it is. Now, is that all there is? That's all there is to quality. That's the ultimate account of what quality is. But that's not where we end. That's why I think this is a conclusion. You can pull this out. That's why I like to make that a conclusion. You can pull that out and say, that's where the analysis of quality ends. But that's not the end of the analysis of quality, right? Not the same thing. So where do we go? For the moments of relation to be equated as referring to the same process is for them no longer to be held distinct against one another. So they collapse into one another. So attraction and repulsion have actually formed now, they've gone into one another, as you put it. They sync together, the terminology, going together with itself. So the sublation quality determinate relation thus proves to be nothing other than a process of one sinking into the other. As we just read, the one is simultaneously determined as having gone beyond itself, and as unity, the one, the absolutely determined limit, is posited as a limit that is none. It is no limit. It's indifferent to itself. That's what that means. A limit that is in being, but is indifferent to being. That's what quantity is. The quantity, qua magnitude, that which can be increased or diminished without making any difference, determination to it. Existence thus is an indefinite, not Hegel term, but at least makes the point blah. Now, if that's right, then Hegel's made the case for why quality must come first. Quality is less determinate than quantity. So in a sense, he's agreeing with our intuition, right? Our intuition is that, well, you have to have something concrete, and then you can have properties like quality on top of that. And what we're really saying is you have to have something, determinate, and then you can put determinations on it, properties on it. And that's what's really working. And Hegel's not disagreeing with that point. He's just saying conceptually that's not how you have to prove them. It's not how they work. Quality has to come first because quality is the more abstract, more vacuous. See what's entailed by it and see that it actually entails quantity. Now what that means, of course, let's just be clear about what it means, is that you can't have reality unless there is magnitude. This is the retrogressive ground of all that preceded it. So if you stop where we are right now, you would have to say there can be no quality, reality and negation. That's the only qualities we're talking about here. Primary and secondary qualities are a long way off. So we're all talking about reality and negation. You can't have reality or negation without magnitude, because this is the truth of them. It's the ground of them. They're real, but they're made real by virtue of the fact of magnitude itself. Now, as we'll see next week, that relationship between quality and quantity, that right now quantity makes possible quality, is going to be reversible. You're going to need both, right? They're going to make each other possible, and that's going to be measured. Right? That's where we're headed. That's not where we're at right now. All we're at right now is just the unbelievable claim that quality necessarily and eminently entails quantity. Right? Now, this used to be the favorite, still is, I think, the favorite of Marxists to say, here we see the idealism of Hegel. He thinks that quality comes first and quantity comes second. He doesn't realize that materiality has to come first. Right? Just really not the point. Right? Really just not the point. What comes first is not what's fundamental for Hegel. Right? In fact, if it comes first, that's probably a good reason to think it's not very fundamental. right? What comes last is fundamental, and quantity doesn't come last, right? It's last vis-a-vis quality, yes, but as we'll see, they actually are necessary for one another for reasons we'll talk about. But at the moment, there is no reality without magnitude, and as we're about to see, there is no magnitude without discreteness and continuity. So discreteness, for the first time in the book, we can now say there is an entity, a being. We're, 170 pages into the book before we actually get to say, okay, now we're going to talk about beings, discrete entities, because we weren't authorized to do so. That's why one and many is not about discreteness. So here we have discreteness, but you'll not be terribly surprised by the fact that discreteness entails continuity, and continuity entails discreteness. Just like reality and negation, yeah, we're playing that same logic that we saw in the quality side of this analysis replay itself out in a different vein, right? Here in quantity, because you've got to have now what? The moment of repulsion, the moment of attraction. What's the moment of repulsion? Discreteness, things being discrete from one another. What's the moment of attraction? Continuity. They're all part of one continuous development, a sequence, a series. Now, Hegel's going to say then that if you want to really think then about how this works, you've got to think then about the relationship between discreteness and continuity, and they're necessarily a determination of one another. And he says at one point, this is on 169, that if we're going to think about magnitude, we have to think about number. If we're going to think about magnitude, we have to think about number. Because this is the way to think about the discreteness and continuity of magnitude. This is how to think about attraction and repulsion endemic to magnitude itself. So it's still there, it didn't leave us, right? It's just not been thought out now in quantitative terms. But if you begin to think it through in quantitative terms, where are you led to? You're led to the notion of number. Now he's eventually going to say this is going to lead you to what he's going to call quantitative infinity. Welcome back. Right? It's not qualitative infinity, it's not the same damn thing, but it's a version of that same problematic that we saw there. Things are going to alter and they'll be alterable all the way through to some beyond. We'll have a quantitative infinity and a quantitative finitude and how they relate to one another. Quantitative true infinity, we'll see about how that works. So the first step in that demonstration, the first step in the demonstration that quantity is necessarily infinite as well, magnitude is necessarily infinite as well, is the proof that magnitude is necessarily infinite. How do we prove that? Is through the demonstration that quantity is necessarily, by virtue of its own inherent contradiction between discreteness and continuity, always a quantity. It's always a quantum. And he says that means it's a number. So this is like saying it's something, like saying reality has got to be something, has a self-relation. Number is a quantitative self-relation. Number is a quantitative self-relation. So he says on 168, this is the final paragraph on 168, it's 194 in the German. This one is therefore the principle of quantum, but as the one of quantity. For this reason, it is first continuous. It is a unity. Second, it is discrete, a plurality. Implicit in continuous magnitude or positive and discrete magnitude. Of ones that have equality with one another, the said continuity, the same unity. Third, this one is also the negation of the many ones as a simple limit, excluding of its otherness from itself, a determination of itself, in opposition to other quanta. The one is thus self-referring, self-relating, enclosing an other excluding limit. That should all sound familiar to us. We've been through this on the side of something, right? In quality. Now we're seeing that same logic play itself out now, but in quantitative terms. Well, that means that that magnitude is not qualitative, at least not yet. It is a number, because number is the name for a quantum. So he says at the top of 169, thus completely posited in these determinations, quantum is number. Now I want to stop for a moment because it's easy to get lost at that moment and say, oh yeah, numbers, right? Math, we get it. We know how this works, arithmetic. Those are signs for quantities, magnitudes out in the world. So when I say 1 pound and 1 pound equals 2 pounds, I'm talking about 1 and 2 as being signs for the actual magnitudes out there in the world that are being combined together. 1 pound, another pound, put them together, I get 2 pounds. That's how number system works for us. It's a sign system by which we measure the world of quantity. Yes? Surprise, that's not how it works for Hegel. When he says quantum is number, he's not saying it's convenient that we use a sign or symbol to measure it. Hegel thinks numbers are ontologically real. That's what he's claiming. I think it's worth just sort of catching the magnitude, right, of what he's saying. Because he is claiming that numbers are not signs or symbols of reality. They're not signs and symbols of quanta. They are quanta. So if you want to put him in a camp on the metaphysics of numbers, he's a realist. Right? He's not an idealist. He's not, here we have a number and let's just use it this way, and that's a convenient sign for what we mean by these things we're putting together out in reality. We could change that number system. And no, Hegel thinks they're actually out there in the world. So he's a realist about these. Now, he's not happy with the way realists normally think about numbers because they normally think about them in a Platonic sense as a kind of forms. One is a form. This is Frege. It's the way Frege thinks of numbers. But he's not alone. Right? Lots of realists out there who thought numbers are real in precisely the Platonic sense. And Hegel's saying, no, they're not real in some Platonic other world. They're real because they're out there in the world itself. That's why when we use mathematics, it has an ontological foundation. It's real, it's out there in the world. So magnitude is quantum, and quantum is number. You ought to take those literally. I think it's always good to, when you're reading Hegel, don't do an allegorical reading, don't do a metaphorical reading, do a literal reading at least first. Because that's probably what he means. Right? When he's being metaphorical, like the birth of, the moment of its birth is the moment of its death, he knows how to do that, he knows how to signal that, you'll get it. Right? Here, none of that flourish, because he's deadly literally serious. So at the prima facie level, he looks to me like a realist. He's not a Platonic realist, but he's a form of realist. He's an ontological realist about this. And he says, number is a contradiction. Right? So quantum is number, so magnitude is quantum, quantum is number. And number bears within itself a contradiction. What's the contradiction? Discreteness and continuity. He says it's at once a sum, an amount. So it's discrete, it's countable, we put it together, that's discrete. And it's continuous, it's a unit, it's a component of a series. So it's discrete and continuous at the same time. This is the way he puts it on 170. Look right in the middle of the page on 170. Right at 196, just before the remark. This intrinsic contradiction of number of quantum in general is the quality of quantum. We'll come back to that. Why does he call it quality of quantum? That's already getting us towards the question of measure. And the contradiction will develop in the further determinations of this quality. So the second step is to say, okay, you've got discreteness and you've got continuity. How do they relate to one another? So he says, okay, you show it this way. Magnitude is nothing other than the relation of intensive and extensive magnitude. Intensive and extensive magnitude. Now, why this intensive, extensive magnitude language? And ultimately that leads to degree, right? So magnitude is quantum, quantum is number is necessarily discrete in continuity, and that leads us to degree. Why do we lead to degree? So Hegel argues here that the distinction between extensive and intensive magnitudes embodies the contradiction he's talking about, right? The intensive and extensive magnitudes is just a way of talking about discreteness and continuity. Why? Because a quantum number as discrete, as many, as the product of repulsion, as a sum, that's an extensive magnitude. That's an amount or a sum. That's an extensive magnitude, he calls it. But he says, but as continuous, quantum is also continuous, not just discrete, not just a sum, but it's also continuous. That is the moment of oneness or attraction. Then that's an intensive magnitude. That means it's a degree or grade. A degree or a grade. It's a degree on a scale. So extensive magnitudes are specific amounts or sums. That's the discreteness. These amounts or sums are nothing other than the simple aggregates of numbers and parts of the whole. But we ought to ask ourselves immediately, of what whole are they parts? How does this extensive magnitude belong to anything? The discreteness of an amount of extensive magnitude has its being in what is other than it, continuity. The continuity of the number series. These are numbers, so the continuity of the number series. So each sum is its own self, right? 12 is its own self, but it's also part of the number series, 11, 12, 13, and so forth. So it's both discrete and continuous at the same time. The many discrete numbers thus pass over to the continuity of intensive magnitude. The continuity of oneness, the extensive necessarily has its being in the intensive. It's a degree on the number scale. So it's one discrete unto itself, 12, but it's part of the number scale as well. So it's got a continuity that's built in. So it's both a sum, in that sense it's an extensive magnitude, but it's also an intensive magnitude. It's a degree on a scale. So number then is properly degree as a graduated continuous continuum, an increasing and diminishing scale of degree. This is what he calls it on 183. If you take a look on 183, I know I had you work through here, but that's what he's saying in the middle of 183, 210 in German. It is degree. And then let me make one final step, and we'll be to quantitative infinity, and we'll pick up here next week. Right? So one final step. I know you're worn out. Reason to be, I grant it. But let me take one further step here, and then we'll come back here next week. So quantum as degree is at once itself and other than itself, and it is that because the number of its degree is a moment in the continuity of magnitude. So it's both discrete and continuous. That's all the point. While it is itself by virtue of that same degree. So it is itself by virtue of being, it's discrete by virtue of its continuity. A quantum is thus both itself, it's an amount, and other than itself, it's a unit. It's itself and other than itself. It thus necessarily goes beyond any degree that marks it out. 12 is 12, but 12 only makes sense if it's 1 less than 13, 2 less than 14, 1 more than 11. So there is a beyond of each discrete number on the number series. There is a quantitative infinity then built into number itself, built into magnitude itself. So again, this isn't a sign system that has this feature built into it of infinity. This is the nature of quantitative reality. That it is both itself discrete. You could pull out a weight of magnitude, a blob, right? Pull out a small bit of the blob and say, that's 2 pounds of the blob. But 2 pounds only makes sense when it's 2 pounds of 1 more than 2, 1 less than 3. It's on the number scale that measures the whole damn thing. So it's discrete and continuous at the same time. So it's necessarily a degree at the same time that it's a number. It has to be a degree. But if it's a degree, then it's always already propels itself beyond itself. Every discrete quantum, every discrete amount, every discrete sum, 1, is what it is by virtue of being a moment in a larger scale series of which it is a part. So Hegel will say, exactly at this point, that quantity, magnitude, number is inherently infinitizing of itself. And he will replay the same analysis of, right, it goes 1 up to scale, but then it goes 1 more up to scale, it goes 1 more up to scale. What's that? That's quantitative infinity in the sense of spurious, bad infinity, the non-finite infinity, right? That's what it's doing. So you can always go to 1 more, plus 1 more, plus 1 more, plus 1 more. You can always, I call it the additive form of infinity, right? It's always 1 more, then 1 more than that, 1 more than that. If you get to 1 billion, you go 1 billion plus 1, right? You play this game with kids, right? They know how to play it eventually. Once you teach them addition, they can always, yeah, but plus 1. Plus 0.1, that's enough. Right? What are they doing? They're asserting the beyond. Right? Yeah, that's what they're doing. They don't know it. You could tell them that next time you're talking to somebody, like Thanksgiving, parents will hate you for that. But you can tell them that, and that's what's going on, right? Because that's not just playing with the game of math. You can do that just, most mathematicians would say that's all you're doing is playing the game of math. But Hegel's saying, mathematics is not just a game, it's a wonderful game. It's not just that. It's not just a sign system. It's a wonderful sign system. But if it's got any purchase on reality, it's because it is reality itself. It's because quantitative magnitude works that way. It is at once discrete and continuous. And because it's discrete and continuous, it's always a degree. It's always but one moment on a scale that's always but one moment more. And therefore, infinity, in the sense of non-finite infinity, is endemic to it. It's always asymptotically approaching that endpoint that it can never get to. But as you know, those are the relata, finitude, infinity, now in quantitative terms, discreteness, continuity. And they're both generated out of what? A process that generates them both. That's quantitative infinity. That's true quantitative infinity. This is what he talks about on pages 189 to 190, so take a look at this really quickly. Here's where he introduces the concept of quantitative infinity, bottom of page 189. 218, just above 218 in German. The one is infinite or self-referring, self-relating negation, hence the repulsion of itself from itself. So here he goes back and gets that language of it repulses itself, it others itself. Quantum is equally infinite, posited as the self-relating negation. It repels itself from itself. But it is a determinate one, the one which has passed over into existence and limit, thus the repulsion of determinate from itself, not the generation of something that is like itself as the repulsion of the one. So he's going back and telling you this isn't the same thing as qualitative determinacy, this isn't the same thing as qualitative infinity, but it has a striking parallel to it, right? It's a structural parallel. But of its otherness, quantum is now posited in it as sending itself beyond itself. Now look, you ought to look at that and go, my God, has he just said that quantity has an activity built into it? Does he not know matter's dead? It's recalcitrant dead matter. So said Aristotle, right? We have to impose form or it just lays there inert. And he's telling us, no, actually, for it to be what it is, it has to other itself. It sends itself beyond itself. And that's negativity is not something we bring to bear on it through thought or form being opposed. No, it's actually endemic to quantity itself. We'll get to matter later, but you know, at least that's what we normally associate with this is quantitative magnitudes don't change. We mark them, right, in different states, but they don't change it themselves, right? There's some extrinsic force that makes that happen. Come on, we know how the mechanical materialistic metaphysics operates here. Hegel's saying, yeah, I got all that, I understand all that, but that's not actually how this conceptual structure actually works. There's activity built into quantity itself. It sends itself beyond itself. He says, it consists in this, that it increases or decreases. It is within it the externality of determinateness. Thus, quantum sends itself beyond itself. Quantum, number, sends itself beyond itself. Because it's discrete and continuous, it sends itself beyond itself. This other which it becomes is at first itself a quantum, another sum, another an amount. But a quantum which is not a static limit, here we go back to this limit and constriction thing again, but one that impels itself beyond itself. There's the othering now. He doesn't call it the ought structure here, but it's the quantitative form of oughting, right, that's going on here now in quantity. The limit which arises in this beyond is therefore only one that again sublates itself and sends itself to a further limit and so on to infinity. Here we are back now at a structural and parallel juncture to where we were with qualitative infinity. Now we have quantitative infinity. And Hegel's quite aware of this, right? He's the one who's playing up the parallels. He wants you to notice the difference, right? Here we're at quantitative infinity by virtue of discreteness and continuity, not something another. And that's important, that distinction between qualitative infinity, which is state transformation, straight alterations, right? Alterations of the self-relation of something. And here, alterations in the quantitative determinacy of magnitude. Those are different things. But structural parallel between the arguments works exactly the same way. Why? Because it's still about how things are what they are, discrete, and are that by virtue of being other than what they are, continuous. And that relationship, as he says, the playing out of that contradiction, discreteness and continuity throughout the rest of this analysis, is really what's making it work, just like reality and negation did in quality. So I think, and this is horrible, I apologize for putting it on you at the very end, but it is worth looking at. just to kind of let us know where we're at. Yeah. This is only too long. So there's the two arguments, right? They parallel one another. And Hegel's pointing out precisely this parallel between talking about qualitative existence, or quality as existence, quantity as magnitude. What's built into that? Discreteness and continuousness. That's a number, extensive and intensive number. That gives us quantitative infinity. That will ultimately give us this proportional ratio. And that's all parallel to what we've already seen here with reality negation, something, something other, qualitative infinity being for itself. And that doesn't make him right? That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to show you this. I'm not trying to argue and show that he's right by virtue of a parallel you can make between his argumentation. I'm just simply trying to say there are these two sides of an argument that he's working towards, and he'll be very explicit about it in what you're going to read for next week, which is measure. Because what he's going to say there is not measure follows from quantitative relation and proportion. He's not going to say that. He's going to say measure follows from the necessary interrelation between quality and quantity. And that's what measure is. So at that point, you have to realize what looked to be merely a sequential argument. Here, then, oh, here. Right? That's the way it looks like, and it reads that way. But he's very clear in this section, towards the end of this section, when he's making the transition into measure, again, what you'll read for next week, that really the problematic that's arisen here now is, and he's already hinted at it when he said the quality of quantum, right? What does he mean by quality of quantum there? How does that operate? How does that work? He's using the notion of quality there differently, the same? How's it working? Why does quality belong here at all? He's going to talk about why it belongs here, because these two are mutually implicatory of one another. That it's not just quality entails quantity. That's true, but quantity also entails quality. And their mutually implicative relationship with one another is what measure names. Make a little bit of sense, at least structurally. A lot of stuff to be still unpacked. I'll try to unpack some of it more next week. We'll look at the transition into proportions or ratio relations. We'll look at those. It's about the relationship between quanta, right? So the direct, inverse, and raising to the powers of those relations. We'll talk about those next week, because those are all ways of thinking about that process of quantitative infinity, true and quantitative infinity. And that's what all of those are really about. Those formulas will be about those. And then we'll look at those and how those lead to the relationship between quantity and quality itself. All right. Have I completely worn you out? You okay? Questions then? We got a couple minutes. Yeah, please do.
This is about number as unity of amount in unit.
Yeah.
So if I'm thinking to Holgate's commentary on
Yeah.
this, he'd say like the number 18 is 9 amounts of unit 2. It's also 2 amounts of unit 9, and the way that it's all of those is because the unities of numbers can have a determinate negation of each other, and that's how you get different numbers. But it seems like amount on its own, unit on its own, when we talk about it that way, we're already talking about each of those as number as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Like it feels like we're sort of baking in number into that, where if I'm just reading what Hegel has here, he hasn't actually shown any particular numbers more than he's just shown a structure of what numberhood is.
Right. I don't think he needs anything more than that, right? So all he has to show is this, that quantitative magnitude has discreteness and magnitude as its two defining moments, like reality indication. And what is that? Well, that's really what number is, numberhood in general. Any number exemplifies that structure, but you don't need the actual number, you don't need the numbering system itself to do that, right? Number is what we're going to call magnitude as a quantum. Okay? And then if it's discrete and it continues at the same time, then it's got an extensive magnitude, that'll be the number itself, But it's also got this intensive because it's always connected up to the other numbers in the chain, the other numbers in the line, the other numbers in the number scale. So it's also a degree at the same time. That's the intensive merit. If that's the case, then you've got the quantitative infinity that derives out of that. But what Holgate's trying to do is track it back to like, give examples, right? And the examples he's trying to give, I'm all for, right? I did a little bit of it today, but the examples can get in the way sometimes because then they say, well, then it sounds like it's just, like you were saying, I think that's what you were saying. It looks like it's just a feature of the number system itself. And Hegel wants to say it's a feature of the number system because it's an ontological structure in quantity, it's an ontological structure in magnitude already. That's reflected in the number system, but is not, the argument doesn't proceed by way of the number system itself. That's why he doesn't give you examples.
I guess
he does in the remarks, but he doesn't in the actual text.
I think I'm taking more issue with is, and Holgate has like a, I don't remember if it's a footnote or whatnot, but it's a long discussion on like whether or not the number 1 is a number for Hegel, and people talk about this and whatnot, and it's interesting.
0, isn't it?
He does it for both of them.
Does it with 0 and 1. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
And it kind of seems like this maybe isn't even the right place for that, because I just don't see how. I guess what I'm taking is I'm taking this numberhood argument more seriously. I don't feel like we've earned those examples even of particular numbers. Yeah.
I agree with that, right? And that's why I think that the discussion of mathematics proper from arithmetic all the way up through calculus is in the remarks here, and not in the actual systematic exposition itself. Nothing of the argument itself relies on any claim about arithmetic directly or about mathematics more broadly. It does rely on the claim that there is quanta that are discrete, and at the same time, by virtue of their quanta-ness, not a term he uses, they are also continuous. And once you have that, and he can say, that's what I mean by number, then I think he's done, right? He's got all he needs to make the rest of the argument he's making. Now you can exemplify that, you can give examples of that through numbering, various sorts of numbering examples, but it's not the numbers, it's not the number system that makes the argument. Is that, and I would agree with you at that point when you say this is misplaced, right? But I think Holgate knows that.
Yeah.
Because these are in excurses, if I recall, right? Both those discussions.
Yes, they're working with that. Actually, I don't think that one is, because I don't think that one's in one of the Frege excurses.
Okay. I'd have to go back and take a look at it.
I'd have to as well.
But that would be interesting, right? Because I would agree with you that it's if you bring this in, if you bring the mathematics into the systematic exposition, then you're making the mathematics do the work of systematic argumentation, where the systematic argumentation is supposed to be able to do the work on its own. Is there such a thing as discreteness and continuity, and what does that mean in terms of quantum? That should be the systematic argument, irrespective of what you can do to the mathematics. By virtue of that, Hegel would say, but not in spite of, or in place of that. Is that useful? That's a good question. We're over time. If people need to go, other questions, I'll take them. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I kept thinking about Sofita's question on monism, and I wondered if we could give an answer based on the discussion that you gave me before this one.
Yeah.
When you have subject object, could we see that this is as the many, and then collapsing one that gives us monism?
I want to say yes and no to that, right? It gives us a form of monism,
Okay.
right? It does give us a form of monism. It gives us oneness, right? Rather than manyness, we get to a form of monism. But Hegel is not an advocate of static, rigid, complacent monism, which is what he thinks Hölderlin and Schelling ultimately committed to. There's a lot of vitalism in both of them, but they think they're ultimately committed to a grounded, kind of stayed indifferent being. And the reason why he thinks that is because one is never what it is alone unto itself. It always is what it is by virtue of a process that's generative of it. So the monism in Hegel is a monism of a process, not the monism of a classically understood unity, oneness of all things.
Yeah, but whenever you say the many collapse into one, I took it as a process, not like immediately.
Right. So if the monism is that process rather than the one that it collapses into, then yeah, I'm on the same page. I think that's exactly where Hegel's at, right? But he will note, right? This is the kind of the thing that at the beginning of the quantity section, it looks like all you're talking about is the oneness side, right? You're again, the process falls out and only the product is left over. So we're left with the collapse of attraction and repulsion into one another with quantity. We're left with magnitude. We're left with increase and decrease don't matter to it, and that's all you've got left. So you've got quantum.
Yeah.
And then you've got to show, well, is there anything about quantum that's intrinsically dynamic? Let's just use a broad term for it. And in fact, it does have determinacy, or it can't be what it is. It's both at once discrete and continuum. So
Yeah.
this discussion works at that point. So it's though this happens in Hegel all the time. We'll see a process is generative of relata and their relation. And then quite often, they will collapse in on one another. And what we're left with, in this case, is called the object. We're left with what he typically calls an indifferent point. Right? That's what he calls it. So they collapse in on one. They were distinct, right? And they can still be held distinct, but they collapse in on one another. They have a name. The name here is quantity, because that's the relative name for this. And then he doesn't say, now we need to fix that, and we need to put in, no, you need to see if it has any negativity built into it. And observation tells us that it does.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's good. Good question. Other questions, comments? This is all crystal clear. Come on. We're 5 weeks in, nothing's crystal clear, right? I'm not promising in 10 weeks it all will be. But I think if you made any sense out of this quality-quantity transition, good work today. Good work today. Let's come back next week and talk about the transition into measure. That's hard too, but let's make it into that, and then we'll end with that section with setting up the discussion of how does measure lead into essence. All right? See you next week. Thanks. Thank you.